here's the agenda, folks. So we're going to provide you with an overview of the attack if you've not read into this. So if you don't know what New Life is, where it's at, we're going to give you an overview of what happened. We're going to give you some detailed information about the target because it's a big church, and all this plays into what we're going to talk about at the end of the presentation. Going to give you a briefing on the adversary. We're going to talk about the security plan, and what that means is the security setup that the church had at the time. So even though this is back in 2007, New Life had a safety or security ministry, and we're going to talk about what that looked like on that day. We're going to get into the attack itself, so I'll walk you through the attack, and then we're going to get into considerations for security design. All right? Okay. So here's an overview of the event itself, of the attack. So New Life is a mega church located in Colorado Springs, Colorado. This attack happened on December 9th, 2007 at 1 p.m. in the afternoon after the service. So the service was over. There was a guest speaker or some kind of speaker there that day, and there were some other things going on around the church. A pretty good-sized property. Matthew Murray was the adversary. He was an insider threat, so you guys know from our terrorism webinars and our webinars about physical security design, the insider threat is that person that either has access to that site and or has detailed information about the physical protection system. And we're going to talk about what he did when he got on site and what he waited for. So there was some insider information that he had because he had actually attended that church in the past. At this attack at this church, so there were two attacks. We'll get into that. There was an attack earlier that he conducted, and then he came down, drove down from that attack, went home, did some things, and then attacked the church. At the church very specifically, there were 2 people killed, and I think there were 3 wounded, and we'll get into that. And then the adversary was neutralized by somebody on the site security team, and they call it something a little bit different, and we'll get into it. So that's a quick overview of the attack itself. Big mega church. This happened back in 2007. We had an insider adversary commit the attack. There were 2 people killed. There were 3 people injured. And then the adversary was neutralized by someone on site, and that person was a member of New Life security team. All right, so let's talk about the target real quick. I've got a picture, so you got to, in your mind, if you don't, again, you haven't read up on this, understand this was not a small church, not small property. So the church itself, and maybe it's more now, but at the time it sat on 30 acres of property, and I don't think the property's expanded since then. So that's a pretty good sized lot for a church. That 30 acres at this time in 2007 had 2,000 parking spaces, and a lot of this information is, number one, coming from Google Maps, and then some stuff I've looked at recently about the church, current stuff, and then a lot of this is also in Mr. Chin's book. There are 3 buildings on the property. The church is actually 3 separate buildings. So there's a main building with almost 200,000 square feet inside of it, and there is an 8,000 seat sanctuary inside. So that's a really big church, big mega church. There is a World Prayer Center that sits northwest of that main building that's 44,000 square feet. And then there's looks like a dome. So if you pull this up on Google Maps, it looks like almost like a little sports stadium, but they call it the Tent. And that's just east of the main building, and that's 15,000 square feet. So the church itself is 3 separate buildings that sits on 30 acres. So that's a pretty good size location or facility, okay? So this is a picture, this is a photo for you guys. You can see down there at the bottom to the right, that's the dome, so that's what they call the tent. There was something going on inside that day. You can see in the center where the red mark is from Google Maps, that is that main building that's almost 200,000 square feet. And then, of course, you can see, the front of the building there where it actually says New Life Church. And then you can see that prayer center there at the top of the screen. So these are the three buildings that sit on the 30 acres. And then, of course, you can see all the parking spaces because of the number of folks that actually attend this church. So about 2,000 parking spaces on the day of the attack. So pretty good size facility. Let's talk about the adversary. At the time of the attack, Matthew Murray, the attacker, was 24 years of age. On the day of the attack, he was armed with an AR-15, 2 handguns, and after the attack occurred, the police showed up and they started conducting the investigation. There was 1,000 rounds of handgun ammunition on site, so in the car, I believe, and then there were another 1,000 rounds at his home. So let's talk about Matthew real quick. So a lot of people, when we start talking about these shooters, we think this must have been some hatred for the church from the very beginning, or he grew up in a bad environment. That was not the case. So Matthew Murray was raised in a church home from the very beginning. Could have went to public school, or actually even private school. He comes from an affluent family. His father is a neurologist, and I think his mother was I think she was some sort of a counselor, psychologist, something like that. And then she a former, and then she decided to stay home to raise her kids. So Matthew Murray had 2 siblings. So they were homeschooled. Very affluent family. Again, the dad's a neurologist, so they did not grow up in a bad environment that we know of. His mother, Matthew Murray's mother's brother-in-law, is a pastor. So again, they grew up in church. There's a pastor in the family. They're homeschooled, affluent. The father was or is a neurologist, and so not the kind of background that we would think that an attacker would come from, or what most people think about an attacker anyway. Now, some issues with Matthew Murray. He did have ADHD, or he was diagnosed with that when he was younger. Throughout his life, and we're going to talk about it, there was antisocial behavior everywhere he went. So anytime he had contact with folks, and we're going to get into it, work, school, church life, there was behavior that was always odd, and people picked up on that. Okay, he did complete 2 years of college. He was some sort of computer major, so he was really smart with computers. Really introverted guy. Again, antisocial behavior, wasn't very social. There was a grievance. We talk about this antisocial behavior. This is something, if you remember later on, we get into some things to think about. There was a grievance with a former employer of his and a coworker. There was a history. You're going to see this YWAM, that is Youth with a Mission, and New Life Church. So there was a history and grievance with both those facilities. In 2002, Matthew Murray was accepted to this Youth with a Mission organization. He completed a 12-week classroom program, and then he was supposed to move into the second part of the program, where I believe he was going to go to Bosnia. Because of some antisocial behavior and some other things that he did during the 12-week program, that the folks that were running this at the time, they decided to ask him not to go. Basically, I don't want to say he was kicked out of the program, because he later applied to come back in, but they were not going to allow him to go to Bosnia to take part of the second part of the program. And so there was a grievance there. He was very upset about that. Very upset about that because communication with his mother later on, before the attack, he believed there was some bad behavior that went on at this ministry. There were some other people that did some things that were worse than what he said, or I guess what he what other people picked up about his behavior. So he was very upset at Youth of the Mission because he was not able to complete the entire program. Also upset with New Life. Sometime around 2002, maybe a little bit earlier, he was at New Life with his mother. Again, some antisocial behavior. Some people at the church pick that up. They have a conversation with his mother. His mother shares some things. I don't exactly know what that was. This was in a report with the church, and there's a report. There's some information out there. The church got involved. They went to his house, had a talk to him, took some stuff that belonged to him based on his mother's request, and that upset Matthew. So there was a grievance number one with Youth of the Mission, and there was also a grievance with New Life Church. So you've got some background on the adversary, so you understand the size of the target and how tough it would be to defend that target, New Life Church very specifically. You've got some information about the adversary, about his family life, why maybe he was upset with the church and upset with this other ministry. Now let's talk about what happened that day and what the security plan was of the church. Now, background on what happened before the attack at 1 o'clock on that December day. So on December 9th, about midnight, Matthew Murray shows up at Youth of the Mission. So that night, he has a conversation with his parents. He leaves to go to an Applebee's to eat. He leaves that Applebee's. He drives up after he's planned this, and we're going to talk about that. He drives up to Arvada, Colorado, to Youth of the Mission, and using kind of a ruse and deception, gets in. So the front doors are locked, so it's about midnight. They're having some sort of a session or something's going on up there. There were people or the kids or the young folks that were involved in that. The majority of them were off-site in town doing something. There was a small group that was left behind that did not go into town that night. They hear someone knocking at the door about midnight, a little bit after. They open the door. It's Matthew Murray. He tells them that he was a former student or a former alum. They let him in. He asks if he can stay there so somebody can pick him up. He starts acting very strangely. He's there for almost an hour, and at some point they ask him to leave to go wait somewhere else, to leave the property. And at that point he pulls out a pistol and he attacks 4 people. He shoots 4, kills 2 of those inside the house, and then the other 2 are wounded. He then escapes after the attack and then heads back home. Gets back home about 3:30 in the morning. We're going to talk about that. So we'll stop there because we're going to get into what happens there right before we get into the attack. So the security plan that day for New Life Church. So this is the same day, later on that afternoon, same day that Youth of the Mission is attacked by the same adversary. So the security plan for that day, I don't know if it's any different on any other day, but I know according to Mr. Chin's book, there was some sort of a guest speaker there. So there were 3 off-duty, or what we call ODOs, or off-duty officers working at the church. 2, according to the book, according to Mr. Chin's account, I think 2 were assigned kind of the parking lot with 2,000 parking spaces. Obviously, you would need police officers to control traffic. And then 1 was inside the main building, and then he would kind of roam inside the main building itself. There were 5 life safety ministry team members that day, and so they back then they didn't call it a security team, they called it a life safety ministry team. There were 3 armed, 2 unarmed. So there were 2 unarmed ministry members there. There was Carl Chin. There was this young lady, her last name is Assam. We're going to get into her because she actually responded to this in a few minutes. And then there was one other, and I'm assuming he was armed or guessed. I don't remember what he said in the book. But there was also another team member there that was providing kind of close protection for this guest speaker. At some point, I guess after the service, or maybe right before the service ended, he needed to leave, and so Mr. Chin had to relieve him to watch this guest speaker. So based on the information that we have, just think about this. So we've got the security ministry is inside. There are 2 police officers assigned to like the parking lot, and then there's another officer ODO inside. So there is based on what we see, a focus from the inside out. So lots of focus on security on the inside, and I'm sure the reasons for that is the guest speaker, the pastor. It's a huge church, a lot of things going on, so requires a lot of security on the inside. But on that day, outside of the 2 ODOs, not according to the book or not according to the reports that I read, no real focus on security on the outside, again with the exception of the ODOs. Now remember, we've talked about this before. You've heard this from me before. There's a difference in law enforcement operations and physical protection. Physical protection is about looking for things to prevent. Law enforcement operations by nature is response. And so based on that, based on the mission of the police, based on what was happening at the church that day and the focus on inside, we say there's a focus on inside to out, and that happens at a lot of churches. All right. So again, an inside to outside focus. We already talked about this. So Carl Chin did have to relieve this safety team member that was assigned to executive or close protection to the speaker. Before 1 o'clock, the ODOs left, and that was just part of their contract. So I'm assuming they're paid. We have the same setup at Fellowship. We have off-duty officers, Brentwood PD, that direct traffic for us, and they are paid for that by the hour. And so as normal, the off-duty officers leave sometime before 1 o'clock. Now, if I remember correctly, the service started around 10:30 or 11, was scheduled to end at like 12 or 12:30. It ended on time, and they left because most of the traffic had already gone. Now, there were still several people at the church at this time. Chin is armed with a .32 caliber Kel-Tac handgun, something important for later on. Assam, who responds to this, former Minneapolis, Minnesota police officer, she's armed, according to one of the reports that I read, with a 9mm Beretta. I'm assuming that's correct. For security personnel, again now, because one of the security personnel did have to leave, the one that was covering the speaker. So now we have 2 armed security team members. We have 2 unarmed security team members. The ODOs have left, or the off-duty officers have left. All right. So the attack, this starts at about 1 o'clock, the attack itself at New Life. So this thing at Youth of the Mission's already happened. He has fled the scene. Murray has escaped. He has gone home, gets home early in the morning. He starts to blog some things, sends out some communication about the attack or something that's about to happen. He has a conversation with his mother about 7 a.m. that morning. His mother leaves a little bit after 10 o'clock to go to church, and then he says he's going to leave to go to church also. He leaves his house about 10:19 en route to New Life. This was discovered during the investigation based on cell phone records and looking at to see conversations and cell phone calls that were made by the adversary while he was en route there. When he gets there, at some point, we don't exactly, I couldn't find it exactly what time they thought he arrived. Somewhere between 10:45, we think, or the reports think, and right before the ODOs leave. But he pulls onto the property, and he waits for the off-duty officers to leave. So he's actually there conducting his pre-attack surveillance. Now, it doesn't say anything about this in any of the reports. We know that he was an insider threat, but remember, every adversary has to go through that attack methodology that we talked about before. We had Sunday, we had our first Israeli security concept training, phase 1 online. Had a large number of folks from a couple different churches attend that. You guys are listening to this. You guys were walked through that process, and that is what happened here. He has gone through this process already, and he's going through it now. He's getting ready to go through the attack execution. But in this point, what he's doing, he's watching, he's still conducting pre-attack surveillance, and he's probing. We'll get into that in just a second. So when they leave, according to the police report, according to witnesses that were on the scene of the parking lot that actually observed Murray, and according to Mr. Chin, Murray actually deploys smoke bombs, one on the south side of the building, one on the north side of the main building. This is designed to divert the attention of anyone that's inside or outside, and it actually works just based on what we've read. And so somebody reports the smoke. I think the smoke that was on the north end of the building, some congregants, some members of the congregation saw it, and they actually kicked it away. Somebody else reported the smoke from the parking lot. At this point, the security team now that is now inside kind of moving around, trying to figure out what's going on. I don't remember reading anything where they actually went outside. They're inside talking to people that are reporting this smoke coming from the inside. Murray then returns to his vehicle and sits in his vehicle for several minutes. Don't know why. I can assume from studying adversaries and just doing security work like most of you, I'm assuming he's waiting to see what's going to happen. Maybe he's waiting to see if there's going to be a police response, if the police are going to come back. Maybe he's waiting to see if there's going to be a security response from inside. We don't know if he had inside information that there was a security team or ministry inside. It doesn't say that in the book. I didn't read any reports to where anybody knew that, if he knew that information, but I'm assuming this is probing, and so he's looking to see if someone's going to come out and respond. They do not. No one comes outside, so what he does is he's parked about 7 spaces away from a white van that has a family, a mother, I think the mom was in the van, the father's in the front seat, and there were also two kids. So there were four people, I believe, in the van, like I said, including the two daughters and the father. He walks out, gets a rifle. As he gets out to get his rifle, he's dressed in black. He also has two pistols. There is a young girl that's going to go talk to someone in this van. She actually sees Murray, and because she's never seen anything like this before, in her mind she assumes that there's some sort of a skit or something happening at the church that day, even though she sees like this kid in black. And so, obviously in her mind she's never been through anything like this before, so she thinks this is something that's planned. Then the attack happens. He walks over, attacks this family's van first. The daughters and the father are all shot. The father did survive, but the two daughters die. I think one died immediately or pretty quickly on the scene, and then later on the second daughter passes. There are a couple of other people that are wounded as the shooting starts. One is a person that's trying to get away, so there's gunfire going off. People are hearing it. They're seeing things. They're confused. As someone's trying to leave the property in their vehicle, there's a report that that a projectile came through the door and that he was actually hit in his lower leg. And then there was another person hit in the gunfire itself. After attacking the van and shooting at several people in the parking lot, he actually moves towards the building. At that point, he is shooting into the building. There are people attempting to come out. There is an unarmed security team member that has heard the gunfire. He is moving toward that side of the building to try to figure out what's going on. He sees and he understands what's happening, and he actually puts his own life in danger and tries to start moving people behind cover so they're not injured. While this is happening, so here, I don't know if you can see this or not. We'll try to make it as big as possible. You can see it says Matthew Murray's car. There's an arrow pointed there. There's a minivan. It says our minivan. So you can see that's about 7 or 8 spaces away. Murray goes up there, attacks the van. He starts to walk into that entrance. As he's doing this and shooting the building, again, this unarmed security team member is trying to get people in cover. There is someone injured also during the shooting. At this point, this is when I think Mr. Chin figures out he's going to respond, and this is when Gina Sam comes running down the hallway, takes cover, sees him, sees what's happening. There's some sort of communication, I think, between the two of them, and then she shoots the suspect or the adversary, and then he goes down. Some reports, depending on what you read, there's some reports where it was believed that she actually killed Matthew Murray. There's actually some news reports and some other reports out from the police department that actually say at some point he committed suicide. So we don't know. I don't know, based on two different reports and different sources. Obviously, she shot him. I think she shot him 5 to 10 times center mass. He falls. So I'm not sure if he took one of those pistols and committed suicide or exactly what happened. But there are some law enforcement reports that say after he was shot, he committed suicide. So again, this is the outline. You can see, I don't know if you can see it, we're going to try to make it big for you. That's his red car, his Toyota, and that's the path he took as he attacked the van, shot at several other people leaving, and then walked in to start the attack, and then he is stopped by Gina Sam. This is Mrs. Sam. She talks about the attack. I want you guys to hear this just quickly. We won't play the whole thing. It lasts like 5 minutes, but it's her perspective, if you've not have seen this, on the attack and what was happening as all the stuff was going on outside.
I lost my job. I moved out of that state and moved to Colorado, and some people had introduced me to come to church. Something kept telling me that I should be on the security team at the church. You're just a volunteer. You don't wear a uniform or anything. And I was only there for a short 6 months, and then it happened. I wasn't going to go to church that day. I was going to stay home. Till I got up early the next morning, which was Sunday, December 9, 2007. And I was reading my Bible, and I decided to take a break, and I went and looked on the internet, and I had just noticed, just by chance, I noticed a real small sentence in the upper right-hand corner of my computer that said there was a shooting at this Christian facility that I was unfamiliar with in Arvada, Colorado. And even though it was 70 miles or so north of where we were in Colorado Springs, I just got instant chills, and I just knew he was going to come to New Life Church. So I called the director and I said, "Did you hear about this shooting in Arvada?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "I'm coming in." The description of the gunman was very vague, as typical. White male in his 20s, no height or weight, possible beard, possible glasses, and that's pretty much it. At about 5 to 1, I was standing in the front lobby, still very crowded, and a volunteer behind the big round volunteer desks says loudly, "Security!" And so I turn around and look at him, and he points toward the front doors, and he said, "That guy says there's something weird going on outside." So I go talk to this man, and he said, "Yeah, there's like a smoke bomb outside the steps." So I was just thinking, should I call the fire department, or what is this device? Is it a dud? Is it going to explode? And still trying to keep everybody back. Some people said it was one white male in a red car, and a couple people said it was three white males in a white car. And this is typical, cops know that we always get different witness information, so I was going to write down, make note of both. And so I went inside, and before I could start writing down the names, before I'd forget, the volunteer said, "There's another smoke grenade outside the cafeteria doors," which was far from where I was standing. And before I could even say another one, I hear this muffled pop, pop, pop noise coming from the east hallway, which was on my left. And the east hallway is over 100 yards long and 30 feet wide approximately, and it is the busiest hallway in the church. So I immediately go over there, and as I'm making my way to the beginning of the east hallway, these loud thundering cracks of a high-powered rifle just start ringing out, and I hear everybody screaming, and someone's like, "Get down, he's got a gun." And I thought that the gunman was inside our church. A taller security guy behind me says, "There he is, Gene. He's coming in the doors right now." Well, the gunman's entering the complete opposite end of the hallway where I stood. So he had been shooting through the doors of the church. So he was shooting into the masses of people. And so I pulled my gun out of the waist of my jeans where I keep it, and I just sprinted down the hallway toward him. And all of a sudden, everyone's gone. There was no one left in the hallway except for me and the gunman. And he's pulling open the second and last set of these heavy glass doors. So I took cover in this hallway on the right that was perpendicular to the east hallway that he was walking down. I put my gun in the high ready, and I was just going to wait for him to come up to me, and I was going to shoot him, perpendicular, and then I'd shoot him. I stepped up to the corner of the hallway, and I shouted at him, "Police officer, drop your weapon." And he turns toward me, and I shot rapidly 5 times and knocked him back completely on his back. And he sits up, and I walk toward him, and I said, "Drop your weapon or I will kill you." And he's shooting at me now, so we're shooting at each other. Obviously, I'm going to keep shooting if he's shooting at me. And then he tried to duck behind this hallway, and I couldn't lose sight of him, because then I'd have another situation. So shot him again for a total of 10 times. And I had told him, drop your weapon. I gave him fair warning, and I just knew that he could kill me, and then he'd kill those other people. So I had to take his life. So another security officer runs up, and he said, "Go check the lobby." And he stayed with the body. And so I ran down to the lobby to make sure there was no more gunmen. I checked it and cleared it, and I saw the police cars start to pull up.
What we know is that a gunman opened fire here in the parking lot at New Life Church right behind me. People called for help at about 1:13 this afternoon, and police arrived here just a few minutes later.
The Colorado gunman, Matthew Murray is his name. He killed 4 people at a missionary training center and at the New Life Church, where you were just hearing the pastor speak. He apparently was on a mission to kill many more, but he was taken down by a hero by the name of Gene Assam.
I had never been involved in a shooting before. I'd had to pull my weapon just about every day in Minneapolis, anytime, day or afternoon or nighttime. You could pull your weapon in Minneapolis, and we usually did. But I've never been involved where I had to shoot anybody myself. So I just waited for him to ask the question. I just waited until we got to what happened, and I couldn't remember everything. But because I was immediately taken downtown, and one of the detectives took me home. One of the female detectives took me home, and she collected my clothes for evidence because they had his blood on them. I was taught that after you shoot somebody, handcuff, whether they're dead or alive. And so that's what I was trying to do. I did not run away, and I didn't think for a minute to run away. I just knew that I was given the assignment to end this before it got too much worse, and I just prayed for the Holy Spirit to guide me. I just said, Holy Spirit, be with me. My hands weren't even shaking. I got a phone call from one of the secretaries at the church, and they said, the White House just called, and President George W. Bush would like to meet you. And wow, that was amazing. So we got to meet President George W. Bush on January 31st of 2008, and he looked right at me, and he shakes my hand, and he says, good job, I'm proud of you. It was awesome. I'm sorry that people had to die, very sorry, and I don't want to make light of it. And to meet the President of the United States, for him to take time out to tell me I did a good job, that was an unforgettable experience. I'd like officers to know, male or female, it doesn't matter, just to know that the bad guy has nothing over us. We have more power than the bad guy. We have the equipment, we have the training, and we have the courage. I mean, that's why we became police officers. So never get a defeated mindset, and never let fear overtake you, because he's got nothing on you. We are the police officers. We are there to protect and serve, and we took an oath to do just that. And God bless SWAT, but don't wait for him. If you got an active shooter, you go in and you do what you're trained to do. And whether you live or die, you go in, because that's what you took an oath to do.
So just some things for us to, so you've heard Mrs. Sam's account of the attack. We went over detailed information over the adversary, what the target looked like, what happened before, what happened during the attack. She mentioned some things about afterwards. So you've got a pretty good idea, I would assume, of what happened on that bad day in 2007 at New Life. So let's talk about, based on all these other 12 webinars that we've gone through on use of force, terrorism, use of armed security teams, what all that means, how we start to plug all these things together as we continue to provide these modules for you. What does that mean for you, and what are you picking up out of this, or maybe how should you look at this? So again, remember, none of this is criticism. This is just some things, or some lessons learned that I'm sure the people that were there will probably tell you the same thing, and just what I see as a security professional who designed security program. So number one, considerations. Those of you that went through our Israeli Security Concept Sunday, you got a really big dose of this, and you're going to agree. So the adversary, including this one, will be required to follow an attack methodology. They always do, and he did, and I'm going to walk you through that in just a second. So remember, the requirements for a successful attacker, number one, If I'm going to attack your church, I need to have detailed information about your church. Matthew Murray was an insider. He had attended church there before. We don't have information on it, but based on his actions on that day, pretty sure that he attacked the pre-attack surveillance before the attack, then there on that day at 1 o'clock, and then, of course, the information that he could have gathered online. So he was very skillful at computers, went to school for that for 2 years, and was known to be a computer guy. So no telling what kind of information he could have gathered on the church just sitting inside of his bedroom. So number one, gather information. He had that information. Number two, I need the element of surprise. Again here, the theme of our church attacks, when we look at the church attacks where citizens have responded, whether those are security team members or citizens coming from the outside. So we're looking at New Life, somewhat at the church attack that happened just a couple years ago right here in Nashville, about 15 miles from where we are right now. So we had a citizen respond to that after the shooting that actually got the adversary subdued. When we look at Sutherland Springs in Texas, and also when we look at the White Settlement Church attack that happened just in December of last year, it was a surprise. The attack itself was a surprise, even when we go back and start to look at information that the church, most of the churches knew, whether that was something that was happening in the parking lot before, things that had happened a couple days before. For whatever reason, there's still a surprise. And so I need that element of surprise. I've got to keep this from the church or from you. I'm not going to directly threaten you as the target. And so I need the element of surprise. Number three, I need to have mobility. This, with the case with Murray, he was able to be mobile in that parking lot. There was nobody there to stop him. He was able to make his way into that entrance. And what stopped that mobility very quickly, or pretty quickly, was that response from the team that was actually inside of the church. And so before he could get inside and cause much more damage, he was stopped, and that mobility was cut off by Mrs. Sam. And then, of course, I need to have control. Control comes from the weapons. So that attack or adversary attack methodology, we're talking about maps, we're talking about training material, we're talking about probing. These are things that Murray did. So remember, the most important thing to learn about when we start talking about church security, if we're talking about intentional threats, remember we've got a number of threats. This is an intentional threat. You guys learned that from protecting faith-based leaders. Okay, this is an intentional threat. The active shooter. When I'm learning about intentional threats, I want to understand the adversary and the process they have to go through. And in this case, Matthew Murray did. He had the weapons. These were found after a search warrant was executed on his house during the investigation. Very specifically, there were videos and books about how to use the AR-15 rifle, tactics videos, and other things that the police found where he prepared for the attack. There were also maps, so we go back to the grievance he had with the workplace and with somebody he worked with. There were also maps of another church where he attended and diagrams. There was a map and a diagram of a resident or the residence of someone that he worked with, that he had a personal conflict with. And there was also information about the place of business where I don't remember if he was fired or he just quit, but there was some sort of a conflict because of behavior. And so he had maps and information about them also. And so going through the adversary attack methodology, he followed this just like all adversaries do. Okay? So when we start talking about intentional threats, it's not the gun I need to worry about. It's not the gun class. It's not being armed. The very first thing we need to worry about, because we're talking about prevention, remember, our job is to prevent the attacks, not respond to them. We try to deny that adversary from coming inside the building. So the first thing we need to understand is what it is about the adversary. What is he or she going to do before they even conduct the attack? And again, you folks that attended our Israeli security concept class on Sunday now know this threat process well. Okay? Early detection of adversary activity is key to success. Let me say that again. Adversary or early detection of adversary activity is key to success. If we think about this attack, he set off a diversion. That diversion went off outside. As this is happening outside, the security team members that are inside are running around trying to talk to people. They're trying to make sense of what's going on in the parking lot. That was done on purpose during a probing act or an act of probing And then, of course, as that happened, he's sitting and waiting and testing to see if something's going to happen. We can be sure of that. Okay? So as that's happening, it throws them into confusion. They're trying to figure out what's going on. Then he starts the attack in the parking lot, the element of surprise. We've already talked about this. Right? It is a surprise to the security team inside because there's no one outside to be able to respond to that or pick up these early indicators of something happening. All right? So again, here, it is important to understand the sooner that we can pick up something unusual, and when we talk about sooner, we mean as far away from the assets as possible, that's outside the parking lot, the better off we're going to be. Receive proper training, so another consideration, and deploy with the proper equipment. So again, this is no criticism of anybody that was there. The threat was neutralized once the threat got inside the building after he left the parking lot. After the attack into the parking lot, he started that second part of the attack inside the building. But if we go back and if you read the book, Carl Chin even says in the book, you know, I made a bad choice that day. He was carrying a .32 caliber Kel-Tec. And especially a building that size, he admits he made a bad decision or that would not be his choice of weapons that day. We can get away from guns. Just understand whatever you believe your threat spectrum is and whatever it is you think you need to respond to, have the proper training to deal with that, have the proper equipment to deal with it, be trained in it, and have that with you at all times. It's going to be times like this when we figure out our equipment doesn't work. And figuring out our equipment doesn't work doesn't need to happen that day, or that maybe we're outgunned, or maybe this is not what we need to respond with. It happens during training. We do a lot of weapons classes at Michael Mann Security Services, and one thing that happens at every pistol class with new students, even though we give them an equipment list, it's a copy of, we teach the modern technique of the pistol. So what we teach is just like going to a gun sight 150, and we put out a very similar equipment list. And what people figure out during that first day of training, a lot of times, is the equipment that they have does not work. They don't like their holsters. They get upset. Then, that night they go to a gun store or they get online, they order something new. So the time to figure out that you don't have the right equipment for the job or the right tools for the job is in training. All right? Something else to think about when we think about considerations. So just kind of going back to police. In big church, especially if you're a part of a big ministry like we are, where we have police officers, understand that the police are trained to respond to something. Even though they are involved in crime prevention, I will tell you, especially you folks that have been through some of our adversary training or adversary threat detection training, what it is that we teach you on what to look for the adversary is very different than what the police are taught. Okay? So what they're taught when they start looking for, when they're in some sort of crime prevention mode or conducting a crime prevention operation, those indicators are different than what you need to learn to be able to see that adversary activity early. So I say all that to understand, hey, we use police officers also, but they're there to direct traffic and make an arrest if something happens. But the job of protecting and early detection falls on the security function, not the police officer. The police officer has a very specific function, and that is not early detection, that is not prevention, that is traffic control, and that is the arrest of a subject and the response if something bad happens. Okay? The only other thing I will say, we didn't stick up here, and you've heard me say this before, I said it as we started with considerations. Our job as protectors is prevention, not response. Prevention is always made up of information that we gather. Sometimes that's information before. And going back to that day, because of the attack at Youth of the Mission, the security team at New Life that day was on a high alert. They had actually gotten a description of the suspect off the news. Somebody had printed it up. I think Carl Chin actually did it. Took it to the church, and they were actually on a higher alert that day because of the attack that had occurred. Of course, they had no idea that they would be attacked by that same adversary and these bad things would happen. But that is our job. Our job is to prevent and to see that early activity outside before. And again, that's based on information that we gather, and that's based on deterrence. And that deterrence happens when we're looking for that adversary activity early, and that is outside, practicing our concentric rings of protection, which is that layered approach, which means we're going to deny the adversary access. We are going through those functions, which includes deterrence, right? So the deterrence and the detection piece, which is very important. And then, of course, conflict avoidance, which means whatever we do with our mission, it does not conflict with the mission of the church. All right, folks, a lot of stuff you've heard before. We put all these things together so we build on what we've done in the past. Hope you got something out of today. If you have any, we've got 2 questions. Excellent. All right, we got 2 questions from somebody out there. Yep, I will repeat those because Scott can't read very well anyway. So I have to repeat them because you can't hear him. Sorry. Go ahead, Scott. Yep. So James in California, he attended our Israeli security concept training on Sunday. Just ask a question. Said, that's a big property. Seems like they might have been understaffed. Can I actually suggest a ratio of security team members to the property? Here's what I would say about that. I would say it's not really based on the size of the property. It's based on what's going to be required to set up your concentric rings of protection or your layered approach. And we talked about this with James on Sunday. So it's not based on the number of people that you have at the church. It's not based on the size of the property. It's based on the area that your folks are going to have to cover, what they can observe, and what they can't see or what they cannot observe. A church this size, I would probably say, and I've never been there, just based on what we've read and what we see on Google Maps and what we learned from the attack. Probably, I'd guess 8 to 10 to practice those concentric rings of protection. I don't know for sure. I've not been there, but again, it's not really based on the number of people, the size. It's based on our layered approach and how many people we're going to have that. What's our second question, Scott? Absolutely. So Perry's asking a question. We have a church protection specialist certification. It's online. He's asking about that. We're going to address that. Those are 3 modules. Those are all virtual instructor-led training modules, so you don't have to leave your home. You can do it with your church or with your team at your church, or you can do it from home. If you sign up for that, you'll get the link to do it. So they're 4 hours in length apiece. The first one gets into how you set up a security team, what concentric protection, what that looks like, what equipment you need to have, how to respond to emergencies, conflict avoidance, conflict management, and exactly what it is you're looking for as you provide those concentric rings. Second module gets into your training and certification on medical response, CPR, stop the bleed or bleeding control, bloodborne pathogens, use of the AED, and that's for children, infants, and for adults. And that fourth module gets into the use of the handgun. It gets into equipment selection. It gets into a lot of stuff about deploying the handgun. And if you're in the state of Tennessee, that will cover your concealed carry permit requirements. And so 3 modules, 4 hours apiece, very, very inexpensive. I think those modules are running $75 a piece. And so with that, you get a library of videos. So you'll have access to a library that cover all of your skills that you learn in the modules. And then, of course, you get a number of certifications to include CPR, AED, carry permit, and some other conflict management-related certifications. Thanks for the question, Perry. Okay, any other questions? None? All right, folks, we hope we went over, but that's a lot to talk about in an hour. Hope to see you next week. I'm sorry we actually had to postpone the civil unrest for next week because of a service we've got at Fellowship tonight. Thanks again for joining in. If you are serving, if your church is open back up again, you're out there, we're going to be praying for you. We're going to be thinking about you. Please be careful. A lot of crazy stuff going on in the world, but I want you to remember this. None of what we see today is new. This was happening 2,000 and 3,000 years ago. None of what's happening in the United States today is new. This was happening 8 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. We know that it's going to get uncomfortable. We know it's going to get more uncomfortable for us. Just because things seem like they're falling apart here now, that doesn't mean they're falling apart in the kingdom, because they are not. We know the end of the story. Be calm. Don't be fearful. And remember, one more question. Sorry. Yep, we got one more. Question is, in our concentric rings of protection, do we focus more on the outside or the inside? We provide the same amount of focus on the inside and out. Here's the good thing about the outside, if you've got it, Trent. We can see activity early, and if we can't validate it's a threat, it's communicated to those inside rings or layers. And so So we're able to watch what we believe may be a potential threat, and we're able to put eyes on it. So the focus is the same. Nothing more, nothing less. Any other questions? Okay. All right, folks. Again, hope to see you next week. Sorry we had to postpone the other event that was going to take place in a few minutes. We've got a service we have to hit and a big detail we've set up. So, again, we apologize, but we're going to be back here at 4 p.m. next week. You can sign up for Eventbrite here in about 5 minutes on the civil unrest for next week's webinar. And remember, it is about prevention, not response.